Hans, do you want to
Welcome
go?
back, everybody, to Inclusive Design 24 2020, brought to you in partnership with our platinum sponsors, Barclays Access and Adobe, and our gold members, Intopia, Tetralogical, and InfoAxia. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have questions for the presenters, just tweet them there using the ID24 hashtag. We can ask them at the end. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community. You can find our code of contact on the inclusivedesign24.org event site. So our next presenter is Sarah Higley, who's going to talk about debugging broken accessibility.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Higley, and my Twitter handle is Coding Chaos. And if you're interested, I often use it to rant about tooltips. And yeah, I'm here to talk about debugging accessibility with emphasis on debugging. So to set expectations off the bat, the things I'm not going to talk about include how to test. This is not at all about testing. It's only about what happens after you've tested and already have issues. And it's not about how to fix anything. This is just about how to find the root causes of the bugs that you find, not about any specifics on how to actually fix them. And also, this is not about tooltips, as much as I love talking about tooltips. To make it up to anyone who was invested in tooltips, if you invite me to an accessibility-themed Halloween party, I will dress up as a tooltip for you. Probably an online party, if we're being honest. So the thing this talk is about is that feeling when you've been working on one problem for far too long and you still have no idea how to solve it. In other words, this talk is about frustration. So to get into why I'm talking about the frustration of debugging something and of spending late nights kind of throwing yourself against a problem and not being able to figure it out, I actually want to take you on a little bit of a personal story, which is unusual for me, but I think it's worth it in this case. So the way that I learned web development and JavaScript development and programming and accessibility was largely isolated because I'm self-taught. I didn't go to school for any of this. And I kind of taught myself web development as I was freelancing and kind of taught myself on the go while I was also working a couple of other jobs after college. And I just didn't have anyone to ask anything. So it was very lonely and frustrating. And even when I got a job at an agency, when I was hired as a web developer and had coworkers that I could ask, I still was kind of afraid to ask for help because yay, imposter syndrome. And this was also true for learning accessibility even after that, because it's often the case that there's only one accessibility person in a company. And I work for Microsoft now, so that's not the case for me anymore. But I didn't always work for Microsoft. And while I was learning accessibility, I was still the only person who was working on accessibility within the places I worked. So I still didn't have anyone to ask for help. And I know that's not an unusual situation to be in, unfortunately. So my learning process was often very lonely and very stressful, and I don't recommend it. And this was true for learning web development. It was true for learning JavaScript and more formal programming, and even through like working on building JavaScript app frameworks. And it was also true for learning accessibility. And that sort of way of learning things causes a lot of doubts. I'd like ask myself, am I missing something really obvious? Am I looking at the right things? Do other people find it this hard too? Do other people run into the same walls I'm running into? Do they do the same things I'm doing? And is there some really obvious solution to this that I'm just not smart enough or knowledgeable enough to find? And none of those are helpful questions to ask. I really don't recommend this way of learning from experience. And I've really realized how kind of bad a way to learn this is more recently, because I nowadays do have some really fantastic coworkers who have really deep subject matter knowledge of accessibility. And it's fantastic to just be able to ask them questions and poke them and say, hey, look at this with me. And that method of learning is a much better option to have friends, to have coworkers, and to pair with them, either pair programming or not even specifically programming, just pairing with someone else in your same field is a absolutely fantastic way to learn and way to gain more knowledge. But as I mentioned, people working in accessibility, all of us, tend to be a little isolated work-wise a lot of the time. So sometimes there aren't really good opportunities to pair specifically on accessibility. So we get back to why I'm giving this talk. Let's do this right now, right here. It's after midnight my time. I have a cup of tea. So I'm ready to do a nice relaxed pair debugging session with all of you. So what's going to happen is I've put together a few bugs that are pretty representative of the type of bugs that I tend to see on a daily basis. My role is a lot of my role is actually helping other people figure out their accessibility problems. So I see a large volume of bugs and debug a large volume of bugs on a day-to-day basis. So I've chosen a few of those to kind of talk over now. And I'm going to treat them as if I were encountering them and talk through how I think about them, how I approach them, what I do to debug, that sort of thing. So start my toolbox, the tools and programs I tend to use on a day-to-day basis include browser dev tools for obvious reasons, Accessibility Insights for Windows, which is a tool that lets you look directly at the accessibility API or one of the accessibility APIs on Windows. Assistive Tech, using Assistive Tech directly to debug. That can include screen readers, keyboard interactions, high contrast mode, and other OS like zoom and scaling settings, voice control, stuff like that. Specs. Specs are a fantastic tool to debug, actually, because if you're not sure of any of how things should be structured or what kind of like specific semantics should be allowed, things like the ARIA spec or the accessibility API mapping specs can be very helpful. And GitHub issues, which are an underrated tool for debugging, because you can see who else has had similar problems and things like that. And just as a disclaimer, as I mentioned, this talk is specifically about debugging and not about testing. There are a ton of testing tools out there that I'm just not going to talk about. And there are also other debugging tools out there for other platforms, like you can inspect the API, accessibility API on macOS as well, and on iOS. And those are sometimes useful, but those aren't things I use on a daily basis. So I'm not really going to focus on them right now. So to dive right in, we're gonna go in the deep end and talk about table semantics. So this is a table I put together mostly for this talk. And in this hypothetical scenario, there's a bug on this table that says that NVDA's table commands are not working properly and are not properly navigating between cells as expected. And what that means is NVDA's table commands are Control plus Alt plus arrow keys, and they're expected to move from cell to cell across rows or up and down columns. So when I get a bug like this that says X screen reader is not behaving as expected on X component, especially when it's something that is semantically complex like a table, the first thing I do actually is not to use the screen reader itself. What I generally do is jump straight into the browser and look at the markup with DevTools. And then I will also use specs to compare the result of what I find with DevTools if I need to. So step number one for me is generally to open up the page in Firefox. So I'm going to do that. Right now, I have this working example of a table. It has a fixed header row, and it has a fixed first column as well. So I'm going to inspect this. And the reason I often use Firefox for debugging semantics specifically is I really like their developer tools for looking at the accessibility tree. So Firefox has this entire tab devoted to accessibility. Chrome has accessibility information for elements embedded right in the elements pane. So if you are in Chrome and you open up the elements pane, you can inspect the DOM, and for any given node, you will see along with like the styles information and stuff like that, you'll see a tab called accessibility, and you can look at accessibility information. And that's, it's not bad. But the benefit of Firefox's tools is in the accessibility inspector, you can select accessibility nodes on the page in the same way you can inspect DOM nodes in the elements pane. So I can go through and choose a specific node, and then I can walk the entire tree in the accessibility inspector and really easily see things like relationships between accessibility nodes. And it's also worth noting that the accessibility tree is not a one-to-one thing with the document element tree. So you can have elements that are in the DOM that are not in the accessibility tree, and you can have elements in the DOM that are like divs but have a role applied or something that show up in the accessibility tree as the role, specifically the type of element that it was turned into via role. If you look in the elements inspector, you have to like do that extra mental work yourself, where you have to take into account like the type of element and the role and potentially other attributes. And the accessibility inspector does that all for you. It tells you the calculated accessible name, stuff like that. It's just, I find it much easier as a like simple way to get a sense of what's going on. In this particular case, it looks like what is going on is that there is a row. The first row of the table is actually this first column, which was coded like that so it could be fixed. This is a really bad call. What it's done is it's essentially defined the first column as if it were a row, and that screws up the calculation of the number of columns there are in the table and associations between column headers and rows. So I can see that's obviously one problem. If I collapse this row and I look at the rest of the table, I can, by using the accessibility inspector, immediately know that there are these section nodes in the accessibility tree under the table, and that immediately looks kind of weird because section nodes are not table-related roles. And so in Firefox, divs and other generic elements are exposed in the accessibility tree as sections. So I can see this looks immediately a little bit weird and could potentially break up associations between rows and cells in the table and the rows. So I can tell this because I run into a lot of issues like this, but if you weren't sure, for example, if you found this and you weren't sure if it was correct, something you can do is go directly to the ARIA spec. And so I know that idea of like, oh, just go look at the spec is often unhelpful and kind of overwhelming. So to help with that, the way I generally use the ARIA spec is I will jump directly to whatever it is that I'm interested in at the moment. And for most of the time, that's accessibility information, these characteristics, this table of characteristics for any given role. There are other useful things in the ARIA spec that I do refer to when I'm debugging, but by and large, often what I'll want most of the time is to look at the characteristics for a specific role, or sometimes look up an attribute directly. So to do that, to navigate the ARIA spec, because it's long, the table of contents can kind of sometimes be overwhelming. So what I do is I use the browser find directly, and to find information about a specific role or attribute, you just type in that role, the name of that role, and then the word role, and that will generally bring you directly to that role in the spec. So in this case, I'm interested in table. So I'm right here at the table role. And because in this case, there's something broken about associations between elements in the table, what I'm interested in is the table structure. So within the characteristics table, to find information about that, I'll look at this entry called required owned elements. And that will list the specific roles that are allowed to be children of table. In this case, it's row or row group. And I can even follow that a level deeper by clicking on row. And within row, there's another entry called required owned elements. And then there's, sorry, I didn't need to click on column header. There are essentially roles that are types of table cells. There's cell and grid cell and column header and so on. Row also has this entry called required context role, which defines the types of elements that are allowed to be its parent, or the types of accessibility nodes that are allowed to be its parent. And those are grid, tree grid, table, and row group. So what that essentially tells me is that a table must have a row as a child, or its children must be rows or row groups. And the row itself must have children that are cells and a parent that is a table in this case. So if we go back to this example table, we now know that these extra divs that are inserted in there are not allowed and could potentially cause breaks or issues in the way that rows and cells are associated with each other, which then could cause problems with navigating between rows, columns and rows with a screen reader. So that wasn't so bad, right? This is the dreaded table. I'm clicking on things without meaning to. Yeah, so moving on, it's all downhill from here, right? Tables are the worst. Just as a side note about the table, that particular way of debugging is also something I use a lot with other complex widgets or composite widgets that rely on internal structures. So that includes things like combo boxes, tab lists, menus, trees, things like anything that relies on a specific internal structure. If there are issues with how screen readers in particular parse them and understand relationships, then I'll often jump directly to the accessibility inspector and look at relationships between nodes. And very often that will surface the root cause. So to move on, another type of semantic issue, but a little different from the first one. In this particular bug, there is a navigation region that has a list of links. I made an example that has 3 links: home, about, and contact, and the bug says that a screen reader, or NVDA in this case, isn't reading the index of the link when tabbing through them. So what that means is if you tab through these, NVDA isn't reading, for example, home 1 of 3, about 2 of 3, etc. So if I get a bug like this, to debug it, I actually use a screen reader directly, not to test, but to debug. And part of the reason I included this bug is, well, part of it is that I get a lot of bugs like this that make certain assumptions about how screen readers should read content. And the other reason is I knew that including assistive tech and screen readers as tools for developers in here might be kind of controversial, because some people do think that those of us who don't rely on a certain type of assistive tech because of a disability shouldn't be testing with it, because if you don't rely on it, there's a good chance you won't know how to interpret the results correctly and might essentially make things worse because of misconceptions about how screen readers should read something. And I'm really sympathetic to this point of view, because I've personally witnessed a lot of problems caused by this, caused by an assumption that screen readers should read something a certain way, when in reality that's not the case. And I've seen a lot of stuff like this piece of code displayed on screen where you have a list element that has an ARIA label of home, 1 of 3, essentially forcing a screen reader to read the index and position by embedding it in the name of a control. And this is not a good idea. If you're unsure of that, this is something I very much don't recommend doing. And it kind of comes from that misconception, someone using a screen reader who doesn't know how to use it. But rather than just blanket saying never use screen readers, I think that there's a way to use screen readers as a tool to debug and to test, but it's really important to do so very strategically and with a knowledge of the limits of your intuition if you don't rely on screen readers. And not just screen readers, this goes for other assistive tech as well. If you don't use voice control, don't assume you know how voice control should behave. So I made this, so the way I suggest using a screen reader to debug is, or even to develop, is to, as much as possible, run a screen reader against your code, your production code, and then against the most simple vanilla semantic HTML version of that same pattern. In this case, we have our styled list of links that could potentially have maybe other JavaScript managing focus or doing something on it in context in the app. And then we have a very simple vanilla HTML list of links with no styles, no JavaScript, nothing. I did this in the browser. Let me, 1 second. Making sure I'm sharing my computer sound. Okay, I'm going to start NVDA. Give my computer a moment to think.
Debugging broken accessibility. Sarah Higley, Mozilla Firefox. Debugging broken accessibility. Application. Complementary landmark. Previous slide. Complementary landmark. Next slide button.
Okay. Make sure.
Compare. Heading level 3.
We are on the compare heading. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tab through the list of links that the bug was filed on and see what the behavior is there. So I'm going to do that right now.
List with 3 items. Home visited link. About visited link. Contact visited link.
So as I tabbed, NVDA for each link just read the name of the link and then the fact that it was a link, or visited link in this case. So it does what the bug says. It's not reading the index and position of items in the list. Now let's see how it behaves when I tab through the vanilla, unmodified, plain list of links for comparison.
List with 3 items. Home visited link. About visited link. Contact visited link.
So it does the exact same thing. I'm going to turn off NVDA now because it did what
Exit
I wanted
NVDA
it to.
dialog. Debug.
Okay. So yeah, it performs the exact same on a vanilla list of links. So because I did that comparison, I can be pretty confident that the behavior in the production code is correct, that it's not actually a real bug, that it's not reading 1 of 3, 2 of 3, 3 of 3. And I know this is a very simple example, like a list of links. And sometimes you might have examples like combo boxes or trees or whatever that don't have a semantic HTML equivalent. And what I generally do when that's the case is I actually like referring to the ARIA practices guide for kind of examples of more complex widgets like trees and combo boxes and so on. And in this W3C note, there are working examples of various patterns. So I can search combo box, for instance, and I can choose a specific example. And then I could run a screen reader and go through and interact with this combo box and be reasonably confident that the ARIA roles and attributes and states on this example are correct, or are correct as per the ARIA spec. There are issues with using the ARIA practices guide as a direct reference for how you should build code, but if you want to use it as a reference for how assistive text should behave on a specific pattern, it actually works pretty well. So at least as a baseline for how, for getting a general idea and setting your expectations for how a specific screen reader should interact with a specific pattern. Another thing I sometimes do is if you're going way off the rails and have a pattern that isn't even in the ARIA practices guide, sometimes I'll go to a desktop app on the same platform that I'm testing on and find a desktop app that I'm reasonably certain has good accessibility, like maybe the default email client for that platform or a text editor or something like that. And I'll test a control on that desktop application. And that one's a little more dicey because web patterns and web behavior expectations can be a bit different from desktop, but it is one way to at least get a sort of baseline if you can't find a good web equivalent to set to refer to for how something should behave. And that just helps, it helps you not rely on your own intuition about how a screen reader should behave or other type of assistive text should behave if you don't use one daily. And I've also seen people recommend make yourself rely on a screen reader for a day or a week or something. And that's, not a bad thing to do. But even trying to just use a screen reader for a day or a week is not the same as relying on it and being trained on it and using it for work and so on. So even if you've done that, even if you feel reasonably comfortable with a screen reader, I think it's better to just focus on like only test on like atomic patterns, only test on things like a tree or a list of links or a table, and not overall, don't make judgments about overall usability or anything like that, and do direct comparisons, don't rely on intuition. I still do this. Like I will only assume I know what a screen reader does if I do a direct comparison, and if not, then I'll ask someone else. For example, my coworker Ryan, who is blind and uses JAWS daily, and not only that, has extremely deep knowledge of even like historical screen reader patterns. But I know that not everyone has a Ryan. So if you're in the position where you have to make screen reader judgments or assistive tech judgments, comparison is best, or reach out to the community and ask. I think this is also, as a personal note, I think this is also kind of made worse by the fact that a lot of developers develop on Mac. And so the screen reader that they familiarize themselves with is VoiceOver, which is, for desktop, at least, a minority screen reader and doesn't at all reflect interaction patterns for Windows screen readers. And so I get a lot of kind of like misconception upon, or I see a lot of bugs that are the results of misconceptions, or fixes that are the results of misconceptions of how screen readers should behave. And obviously this goes beyond just screen readers. There are also misconceptions about how things like high contrast mode should behave, or other like color settings or scaling settings on different OSs, or magnifiers, voice control, keyboard, things like that. Like, generally, it's best to just not assume you know how something should behave if it's not something that you actually rely on. So that was the root cause of this bug. The root cause of this bug was misconceptions. Moving on to live regions. Live regions, in contrast, are a very technical and difficult to debug type of issue. And I included this one because I tend to see a lot of live region issues get to me, not because everyone is using live regions, but because they're one of the hardest ones to fix and to debug kind of on your own if you haven't really done a deep dive into them. And this is particularly true because live region support across different browsers, different screen readers, different OSs is highly variable, to make an understatement, and also very poorly documented. Even what the behavior should be is often poorly documented, so it's often particularly hard to debug. So the way I approach having a live region bug, in this case, let's say that the bug is that when you're, I have a form here, and as you tab through the form, an error appears on Blur. And the specific error in this case is that this specific screen reader is not reading the error when it appears. Another type of error that I often come across is kind of the reverse, that sometimes screen readers read a certain error too much. Like you'll have some sort of live region announcement that you've appended to the DOM, and it's read like 3 times, or it's read when you don't expect it to. So the way I approach this one is to break out the more heavyweight debugging tools. We're going to look at the API itself. And before doing that, though, what I usually do is I'll open the offending page in the browser. In this case, I've made a simpler example for ease of demonstration, where I've made a couple of buttons that will just create a live region on demand. And the very first thing I'll do is the first thing I almost always do, which is just inspect the thing. Make sure that it has the correct rules and attributes. If I need to, I refer to the ARIA spec and see what live region rules and attributes are needed. For brevity, I generally don't need to do that anymore, but it's always an option. And I can see that in this case, ARIA live assertive is present, and you know, so it's not the most obvious thing going on. The other thing I'll look at is whether DOM updates are actually happening in the place you expect them to, like whether the content of the live region is actually being mutated. And to aid that, sometimes just looking at the browser elements pane isn't enough, especially if you're using something like a single page app framework, like React or Angular or your framework of choice, because those handle DOM mutations for you. And it's really easy to get more mutations, more like, by mutations, I mean like an element changes or it gets added and removed. And you can get more of those than you expect because if you have a JavaScript framework handling DOM changes for you, because if you have some weird state stuff going on or your DOM diffing isn't happening correctly, you can have that JavaScript framework like remove and add elements or change elements out without it being super obvious just looking at the elements pane. So to aid in that, I made this mutation observer. This is just a function that creates a mutation observer, which is essentially a way through JavaScript to watch any DOM mutations that are happening, and it logs those to the console. So what I do is I just grab that quick gist that I have so I don't have to relook up how to do this every time. I paste it in the console, and then I'll grab a reference to the specific element I want to watch. In this case, the live region itself. I want to see what changes are happening to the live region. So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to use this element in the console. And then I'm going to call my function on that element. And then once I've done that, I can go trigger a live region mutation and watch that the DOM actually is changing, that the live region itself is actually changing and only changing when I want it to, and only with the changes I want. So that's one way I debug. If I find that everything is happening as expected, what I'll do at that point is I will use Accessibility Insights for Windows to actually look at whether the browser is firing the live region events that I would expect it to fire. So I can't demo this live, unfortunately, just because of the way I'm sharing my screen. So I added some screenshots to help. So what I do is go in Accessibility Insights. I would find, again, just to be clear, this is Accessibility Insights for Windows. It's not the browser tool, it's the desktop tool. And what it's doing is it's inspecting the actual accessibility API. And this works for any app you might have on Windows. And it inspects a specific accessibility API, UIA, and this works best on Microsoft Edge. You can do it on Firefox and Chrome. It's just they map to a different API, and then that API maps to UIA. So you're kind of a step removed. But yes, I open Accessibility Insights for Windows. I find the document node, and I will listen on that node to all live region events. You could also pick the specific live region node. Like you don't have to pick the document, you could pick something more specific. But in this case, document node, listen to events, then I'll specifically select the live region changed event, and then hit start recording. And then I'll go to the page itself and start trying to trigger live regions and make sure that the live region changed event is firing in UIA. And at that point, that's going to tell me, is this a browser issue? Is this a screen, or is this a screen reader issue? If the live region event is firing and I can verify that in Accessibility Insights, then it's probably a screen reader issue. If it's not firing, then it's a browser issue. And finally, after all of that work, I will, at that point, start to search GitHub and see if there are any issues filed on the screen reader or on the browser. If there are issues filed, then I would add a comment to those issues with what I've found, especially if it's more up to date, or I'll open a new issue if there are no existing issues. And having done all this work makes you really well set up to file a good issue because you can like really hone in on what's going on. And finally, the last bug. Let's go back to that original table, but look at something a little different. Look at the way it truncates text. And I may have lied just a little bit when I said this talk wasn't about tooltips, because this last bug is about tooltips. This hypothetical bug says that the full text string of the truncated text is not available via keyboard. It's not keyboard accessible. This is because at smaller screens or at higher zoom, this table has reduced in width and a number of columns have truncated so that you can only view the full text of that column if you hover, and then it appears in a tooltip, and that tooltip is not keyboard accessible, which is what the bug that was filed is about. So to debug this, there actually isn't any real tool that I would use, because this isn't really something you debug technically. This is kind of a design issue, right? Like the problem is not that I need to figure out what coding mistake happened to make this tooltip not keyboard accessible. The problem is that there's a tooltip that is on a table cell. The table cell isn't focusable because it's not interactive. So if you're using a keyboard, you're never going to focus it. And even if you could focus it, browser tooltips do not show up on focus. So you're kind of in 2 layers deep of problems here, and none of them are code problems. So the issue here, the issue as stated is the tooltip is not keyboard accessible. So if you take the issue at face value, you will go down this kind of rabbit hole of, okay, I need to make the tooltip keyboard accessible. Well, maybe I'll make my own custom tooltip, and maybe I'll then change this from a table into a grid so that cells can be focusable, and then I'll make my custom tooltip show up on focus, and boom, solved it. But what you're actually doing here is you're letting the design get away with begging the question. And what I mean by that is is actually the original meaning of begging the question, which is essentially that there is this issue that was filed that, as filed, it assumes the conclusion to another deeper question in it. As filed, this issue assumes that this is a good design, that having a tooltip on text truncation is a valid thing to do, and that the real problem is that you just need to solve the keyboard access. This isn't the case. The real question is this a good pattern? Is this a good design? Should you have truncated text in a table that shows up with the tooltip? And really often when debugging something, especially as a developer, it's really easy to get really kind of focused and mired in on details and on technical problems. And when you do that, you end up, it's really easy to miss the bigger picture and to take all issues at face value as filed. But when you do that, if you take the issue at face value, you end up solving the wrong problem. The real problem here is that some designer at some point decided that having rows of equal height within a table is more aesthetically pleasing than letting text wrap. And they also decided that this particular aesthetic opinion mattered more than understandability and access. So the root cause here is not technical, but a design flaw. And to debug it, there is no real trick. There's no spec for truncating text that you can go to. The way to debug it is to step back and to ask yourself, am I solving the right problem? Is this the right question? And to be clear, this particular design affects a number of people. It affects anyone beyond just what the original issue was filed on. It affects people who have low vision, because when you zoom, a tooltip's text doesn't increase in size. Anyone who relies on keyboard or keyboard-like assistive tech like Switch, anyone who relies on touch or touch-like assistive tech like eye gaze. It's also bad for cognitive accessibility because you cannot read all of the text at the same time. In order to read a specific cell, you have to hover over it, wait for the tooltip, and then hover over the next cell. So it's like playing a terrible version of a memory card game where you have to remember everything all at once because you can't refer back to them without going back and hovering again. So I just said for that one last issue about tooltips that the root cause is not technical but design. And I hate tooltips. It's easy to say. Maybe it was just that one bug where we had to think about a deeper cause. But again, it is so easy when debugging to just focus on the issue, solve the technical question that's placed in front of you. And in more cases than just that one tooltip issue, it's good to step back and ask if you are actually debugging the right question, if you're actually looking at the correct issue. So to help with that, let's revisit each of those bugs and just kind of take another look at them and see if the root causes that we found are really the real deepest root causes. So to look at the table bug, going back to that original table bug about the table semantic structure and not the tooltip, the problem here isn't just that someone coded the table incorrectly and didn't use the proper structure. The problem is that based on the way it was coded, it's clear that whoever made it didn't have a deep knowledge of semantic HTML. And so I know the problem of developers these days not knowing their semantic HTML has kind of been beaten to death by other people and doesn't really need more input from me. So I'll be quick on this. And I also think that blaming a specific person for not knowing semantic HTML isn't really helpful, because often the problem is more systemic. Often when you get markup like this, the real root cause is that the people who are working on writing UI have not been hired to be good, to have a baseline accessibility knowledge, and that even after hiring, they often haven't been given training in accessibility. So that creates a company-wide kind of entrenched problem of a lack of accessibility knowledge. And a few individual accessibility specialists are not going to fix this, because if you have everyone else writing bad code, there's just too much volume for a couple people to fix. And so what happens if you don't, if accessibility knowledge is not embedded across developers and designers at a systemic level, is that you end up with div tables. And that is more of the real root cause of this particular table structure. And kind of on the subject of not having widespread accessibility knowledge, another result of that is having these sorts of fixes to accessibility problems, like slapping an ARIA label of home, comma, one of three, like in the second example. And this one is twofold, because it has to do with who is doing the testing. Did the person doing the testing have any real knowledge of the assistive tech that they're testing? And also, did the developer who got that bug stop and think critically about it and have the knowledge to think critically about it? So on the testing side, this is one reason why it's really important to hire disabled people who are familiar with the assistive tech that needs to be tested and how it works and how to test with it. And beyond just hiring, they need to stay. It needs to be a good work environment for them to work in. And they also need to be listened to. And that's, I think, often where it falls short, because if someone says, like, this testing pipeline isn't working, or we're not fixing bugs correctly, or we're not spending enough time to embed accessibility knowledge, if other people don't listen to them, then, what's the point? Why, like, it doesn't help to hire people if you don't actually stop and listen and value what they say. And so finally, going back to that tooltip issue, because I can't stay away from tooltips, the example I gave was kind of contrived. It was a table that I made to be an example, but it was a table I made because it's something I've seen, and very literally, like, the exact issue that I've seen before. I have a screenshot up now that is not something I made. This is actually a screenshot from a real table in a UI framework that has the exact same issue, where text is truncated and then displayed in a tooltip. And so I'm going to leave this particular example anonymous, but I'm going to take a hypothetical that's not really a hypothetical, because this happens a lot, where I've talked with the original team that has the table with the tooltips and talked through why this is a bad idea, why this is a bad design, certain ways to fix it. And then often at the end of all of that, at the end of working with a team to find the root causes, I will find out that, and the team will find out that they actually don't have control over that code, because they've used some sort of external third-party library to render their UI. And despite all of our work on debugging, they can't fix it because they don't have control over the code. This happens a lot. And using external UI libraries isn't a fundamentally bad thing. Like, you can't rebuild your UI every project you do a lot of the time. And often using UI that someone else has spent a lot of time and work perfecting can be good, so long as accessibility is actually part of that UI. So for the team that I was working with in this hypothetical, their problem is not that they designed a bad table or that they coded a bad table. Their problem is that they didn't consider accessibility when they chose that external library back at the start. So one way to kind of address this, or the real root cause, is that accessibility needs to be a part early on of choosing external dependencies, especially when it relates to UI. And I know it's difficult and time consuming, and it requires a lot of expertise to manually go through and accessibility test all of the components that you might want to use. So something quick and easy that anyone can do to evaluate an open source library for accessibility is to go to their GitHub page and search through their issues. And when you look through their issues, you can look to see if an accessibility label for issues exists. And if they don't have one, that's a red flag. But if they do have one, then you can go through and look at the issues tagged with that and look at things like, were they closed as fixed in general, or were they closed because they got stale or just left to hang indefinitely? And you can also look at how the maintainers interact with those issues. Are they open to accessibility issues? Do they ask questions and want to fix them, or are they dismissive? Do they not prioritize them, or at worst, are they hostile? And anyone can check this. You don't need any accessibility knowledge. The people you work with don't need any accessibility knowledge to do this. All they need to do is search GitHub. And I know this sounds hopeful, like, hey, this one easy trick that anyone can do to evaluate the accessibility of open source libraries before you choose them. But the problem is, for this to work, there actually needs to be open source libraries out there that have good accessibility and have good engagement on accessibility issues. And so this gets to the real root cause of a lot of problems out there, which is this kind of ecosystem-wide issue, like root cause, where people en masse as a whole in our industry don't put enough time and put enough care into making good accessibility and paying attention to accessibility issues when they're raised, and prioritizing accessibility as a kind of fundamental initial requirement. They treat it as an enhancement. They say that it's not something currently in the roadmap, or they just let accessibility issues hang. And this happens everywhere. There's a few, there are some people who work on accessibility in their open source libraries, but as a whole, like your choices, if you prioritize accessibility, tend to be pretty limited. And I don't have a magic shortcut for this. I don't have a solution. If I try debugging the root causes of this, all I run into is ableism, and there is no real magic shortcut. So when I was starting out learning accessibility, what I would do is I would bang my head against my keyboard late at night trying to figure out, like, why aren't the combo box options reading when I arrow? Or, you know, like, what is the point of landmark roles, and how do they get presented, and why do I have this bug about them because I thought the structure was correct? And I would spend a lot of time stressing over these and trying to figure them out. And nowadays, I feel like I have a pretty good handle on issues like that. I know how to structure a combo box, even if the answer is don't. I know how to build a grid or a tree grid, or figure out what, you know, the root cause for some weird experiences. But the thing that I bang my head against the keyboard about nowadays late at night is this problem entrenched in accessibility across the ecosystem. So we go back to my initial point that this talk is about that feeling when you've been working on one problem for far too long and you still have no idea how to solve it. In other words, this talk is about frustration. But you know what? That frustration is better with friends. I don't know how to solve this problem. I'm not sure anyone really knows, but I think a lot of people who are working in this space have a lot of pieces to that puzzle and have been doing a lot of good work in fixing kind of these sort of ecosystem-wide problems. And if we all pair together, if we get together and talk about it and share our work, I think we'll get a lot closer to solving it, or at least feel a lot less frustrated and a lot less lonely and stressed as we figure this out. So that is my talk. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. My slides are online at GitHub. And yeah, if you have any questions or want to rant about tooltips, I am on Twitter. So thank you.
It was very interesting, and I think a lot of people got a lot of useful information out of that. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions because we ran the full 50 minutes. So if we do have any questions, we'll let you know. You can reply to those by email, and otherwise anybody can contact you at your Twitter handle, I guess. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be back at the start of the next hour with Rust Weekly, and we'll see everybody back then. Take care.